politics.
Exclusively on Sirius XM's POTUS, channel 124.
Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you.
Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
David Sanger is my guest. He's the White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times, the best-selling author of several books, including The Inheritance, Confront and Conceal, and The Perfect Weapon. He's been a part of 3 teams that have won the Pulitzer Prize. His new book is called New Cold Wars. Notice the plural version, wars. China's rise, Russia's invasion, and America's struggle to defend the West. The book is terrific. David, it's great to see you. I've been eager to ask you about one particular aspect, one takeaway that I had from your book, and it's this. I wonder whether, I'm going to use the expression deep state with my tongue planted firmly in my cheek. I worry that our deep state lacks sufficient continuity to protect us during changes of leadership like we're about to experience, because you left me with the perception that the Russians, and in particular the Chinese, are eating our lunch as they play a long ball game. And here we are, and maybe I'm influenced just by this week's news events. I don't know, but we are caught up in such chaotic times given the polarization in the country, and they use that to their advantage. What do you think?
Well, Michael, first, thanks for having me on. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to go write this book, because I think the biggest single development in geopolitics in the past number of years has been the coming together of Russia and China in a partnership that we didn't anticipate coming, that President Biden told me 2 or 3 years ago he didn't think would happen because the two countries have had such a difficult time dealing with each other. But now we have the emergence of these new Cold Wars, as you note, with an S. And the S is meant to denote the fact that in the old Cold War, we had one adversary, right? It was the old Soviet Union. They had nuclear weapons. We had nuclear weapons. We sort of understood each other. Eventually, it fell into a pattern where we could predict each other. But now we're seeing Russia and China come together in military strategy and in their effort to try to undercut Western institutions and the challenges of Ukraine and perhaps Taiwan in the near future, and in technology on the part of the Chinese. And yet, as you describe it, we're going through a campaign in which this fundamental change is barely even being discussed because we are so wrapped up in, as you point out, the issues that have divided left and right and MAGA and non-MAGA.
Well, and these issues are complicated. And candidly, I'll be an equal opportunity offender. I don't have confidence in either of our candidates to have the requisite skill set and knowledge, deep institutional appreciation for all the issues you talk about in this book. Here's an illustration, and you were just making reference to this, a partnership with no limits. And in the book, you talk about it's a post-COVID world or near about, and it's the Beijing Olympics, and they meet often, right? Xi and Putin have gotten together any number of times.
More than 50, we think, right now.
It's shocking to me. I had no idea that was the case. Speak to that issue.
Well, Xi Jinping calls Putin his best friend. Putin obviously needs the Chinese more than he ever has before. And the only way he's been able to recover from the mistakes of the early days of the war in Ukraine is that he has gotten artillery from North Korea, drones from Iran, and the technology from China, not arms from China so far, but the technology needed to go rebuild his military. But the relationship is much deeper than that, because while they have many differences, they are unified in their belief that the U.S. is their greatest challenger, their greatest adversary, and also a declining power. And the Chinese in particular are convinced of this. And, the more that they watch what happens in our political structure and as you suggested at the beginning, the movement back and forth every 4 years from one policy to another, they believe that the U.S. can be defeated or will defeat itself. And, you raised before the question of the deep state. And I know that is, it started as sort of the phrase started as something of a joke, right? And then President Trump, when he was still in office, began to vilify it as the opposition to thwarting his will. And I think you could probably argue that for the first 3 years of the Trump administration, I do argue in this book, they did thwart his will in many arenas in an effort to try to sort of keep the U.S. on an even competitive keel. I don't think that would be possible in a second Trump administration because he now has learned a lot more about how the government operates. And I think that's why you hear him talking about the need to go replace the deep state, fire people from his first day.
David Sanger's book is called New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. It seems, here's another big picture takeaway for me from your book. It seems that regardless of the administration, regardless of the party of the administration, we seem to fall into the same trap of believing that we can win them, whether it's China or Russia, we can win them over with capitalism. We can win them over with profit. We can win them over by exposing them to the life that we have here in the States. And in the long term, they'll want to come into the fold of the Western world, which, by the way, reminds me, in the way that I've articulated it, of the mindset of President Obama trying to deal with Iran. And I thought he was on the right path. But whether it's Iran, whether it's Russia, whether it's China, whether it's North Korea, what I'm taking away from David Sanger is they're set in their ways. And that has been a losing strategy on our part.
It certainly has been a losing strategy. And one of the reasons I really wanted to write this book, Michael, was because I came back from my life as a Times foreign correspondent to Washington 30 years ago. And when I arrived, it was just the uniform belief that China and Russia, each for their own reasons, would abandon territorial ambitions, their desire to confront us because Russia needed to sell oil to Europe, because China needed access to our markets. And for a number of years, we convinced ourselves that was the case. And we excused every other piece of evidence that ran contrary to it. So even after Putin took Crimea in 2014, Germany the next year signed the Nord Stream 2 agreement. And at the time, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, declared that Putin was a reliable supplier, right, despite all that he had done. And that was all based on just the belief you were just describing, which is, at the end of the day, yeah, they might want to go back to the Russia of Peter the Great and take Ukraine. They won't do it because they need the money more. And time and again, in both Russia's case and China's case, that has proven wrong. And, we see it in Xi Jinping's behavior over Taiwan. We see it in his expansion of his nuclear arsenal. We see it in how he is taking up, turning small islands in the South China Sea into military bases.
This book seemed to me to be a sequel of sorts to The Perfect Weapon, one of your prior works. And it was an eye-opener for me, nonetheless, on the role of big tech in national security. And I'll give you something specific that you wrote about in the book that I think my audience would appreciate. At about the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you have Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, saying, quote, Microsoft could see things we could not. How much of our safety and security have we placed in the hands, loosely described, of Silicon Valley?
Well, they've got control of a lot of it, but not because we placed it there, Michael, because it sort of grew there. The U.S. has long had rules since the 1970s that prohibit American intelligence agencies from operating inside the U.S. It comes out of the abuses the intelligence agencies conducted in the 60s and 70s, spying on Americans. The result is that we are somewhat blinded to cyber activity against the U.S. inside the country. And the Russians understand it, the Chinese understand it, the Iranians understand it. They all see where their seams are. So even during the interference in the 2016 election, we saw the Russians store a lot of their data on American cloud services based in the United States, knowing that the NSA, the National Security Agency, couldn't look at their material there. So now what we are dependent on is Google and Microsoft and many others who have this incredible vision of global networks to blow the whistle. And when they did recently, you remember that the announcements a few weeks ago about the Iranian plots to interfere in the election and get into the Trump campaign.
Yep.
Who did that come from? The NSA? No, it came from Microsoft.
Another lesson of the book, or another thought I have based on the book, is that despite all the concerns that we have about Chinese espionage, the theft of our data, and so forth, here I sit, David, if you can see me, where I'm holding my iPhone in my hand, and every one of us, with an iPhone manufactured in China. And I guess I can make the same point about 5G networks and Huawei. Like, why are we still why do we still have the amount of reliance on those two items if, in fact, the security concern is as you describe in the book?
Because we allowed these supply chains to grow up. They were not a government decision. It was decisions of individual businesses. Apple designed a super chip that's inside your iPhone, and the only company they could find with the manufacturing technology to make it was Taiwan Semiconductor. NVIDIA makes the chips that are critical to developing large language models for artificial intelligence. And they are all made at Taiwan Semiconductor. Now, if I had come to you, Michael, a few decades ago and said, I have a great idea. We are going to move the production of our chips to a reliable supplier who's 100 miles off of the coast of China. And by the way, the Chinese want the island back. You probably would have thrown me out of your office, right?
Right.
So no one really made this decision, but unmaking it is really difficult. Apple's been trying to diversify and produce some in India. NVIDIA has not able to find other suppliers. And this is part of the new set of vulnerabilities that really make this Cold War so different from the last one.
David Sanger is White House and national security correspondent for the New York Times. My audience will certainly remember, and you write about this in the book, the 2012 debate. Mitt Romney says that Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. Barack Obama mocks him. In retrospect, who had the right answer?
Well, I would certainly say Romney was correct to identify Russia as a country that was uniquely running counter to American interests. And Obama dismissed that away at his peril and took a number of other steps, which I criticize in the book, for failing even to recognize or publicly call out Russian cyber activity. But I don't think you can come out of new Cold Wars without concluding that over the long run, the competitor we need to think about is China, the only country that is a military competitor, an economic competitor, a technological competitor, a cultural competitor. Think TikTok, right? So that's the one we need to focus on. It's barely been discussed in this campaign.
And they are on a mission for, you reference cultural, for military, for technological dominance. I mean, that is what they are after, and they are approaching it with sort of a singularity of purpose. And that's what I fear our listeners don't appreciate. Take my final 30 seconds.
It's clear what China's goals are. They make no bones about it.
Right.
By 2049, the 100th anniversary of Mao's revolution, they want to be the largest player in each of those territories. That doesn't mean they're going to do it. It's easy to declare that they're 10 feet tall. They're not always, but if we're going to compete, we've got to focus on the competition.
David Sanger, those who are listening to this program or watching us will love your book. It's terrific, and I thank you for taking the time to write it and joining me today.
Thank you, Michael. Great to be back with you.
David Sanger's book, New Cold Wars, China's Rise, Russia's Invasion, and America's Struggle to Defend the West. You'll love it. We're constantly making promises to ourselves to live healthier. We're going to exercise more. What do we say? Eat right, drink right. Well, isn't it time that you started thinking about your water supply? Drinking right starts with Aquasana. Aquasana water